On the night of September 17th, 1939, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked through the front door of the Regency Club on East 116th Street, the one place in all of New York City where a black man wasn't supposed to enter uninvited. Pause for 2 seconds. What happened in the next 4 to 7 minutes didn't just settle the score. It redrew the invisible lines that governed organized crime in America for the next 3 decades. And it all started because someone thought disrespect was just a joke. September 1939. Europe had just ascended into war. Hitler's tanks were rolling through Poland. America were pretending it could stay neutral while watching the world burn. But in Harlem, in that 30-block kingdom between 110th and 155th Street, people had more immediate concerns than European politics. They were living in what scholars would later call the Harlem Renaissance's second wave, but that's a sanitized term for what was really happening. This was a powder keg wrapped in jazz music and political awakening. The neighborhood was overflowing with southern black migrants who'd escaped Jim Crow only to find a different kind of segregation up north. The Apollo Theater was in its prime. The Cotton Club was still running, though now finally allowing black patrons, not just entertainers. And underneath all that culture, underneath all that music and art and intellectual fervor, there was another Harlem entirely. The Harlem where money actually moved. The Harlem where power actually lived. And in that Harlem, one name carried more weight than any politician, any preacher, any entertainer. Bumpy Johnson. By 1939, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, nobody called him Ellsworth, not if they wanted to keep their teeth, had spent nearly 2 decades building something unprecedented. He was Stephanie St. Clair's enforcer-turned-partner, the calculating muscle behind Harlem's numbers racket. The numbers game, that daily lottery where working people could bet pennies on 3-digit combinations, wasn't just gambling. It was Harlem's informal banking system, its economic engine, its redistribution of wealth from those who had it to those who needed it. And Bumpy controlled it, not through chaos, not through random violence, through something far more dangerous, strategic thinking combined with absolute willingness to act. He stood 6 feet tall, which wasn't remarkable. He weighed about 180 pounds, which wasn't intimidating. But he carried himself with the coiled precision of a man who'd done mathematics in his head before he threw a punch. His face bore a distinctive characteristic, a large bump on the back of his skull, a childhood injury that gave him his nickname. He dressed impeccably. 3-piece suits, Italian shoes, pocket watches. He looked like a businessman, which is exactly what he was. A businessman in an industry where contracts were enforced with baseball bats and broken kneecaps. He'd learned his trade from the best. Stephanie St. Clair, Madam Queen, had taught him that organized crime needed to be actually organized. That reputation was currency. That fear properly applied was more effective than violence randomly distributed. She'd built the numbers operation with brilliant mathematical precision, and when Dutch Schultz and the Italian mobs came calling with threats and guns, trying to take over Harlem's rackets in the early 1930s, she called on Bumpy to respond. And respond he did. The war with Dutch Schultz had been brutal, public, and effective. Bumpy didn't just fight, he calculated. He studied his enemies. He waited for the right moments. He struck with surgical precision. When Schultz was finally killed in 1935, shot in a Newark tavern by the Commission because he'd become too erratic, too public, too dangerous to everyone, Bumpy had already proven something crucial to the Italian crime families watching from downtown. He was someone they had to negotiate with, not simply eliminate. By 1939, an uneasy arrangement existed. The Italian families, primarily the Luciano family, though Lucky himself was in prison, had been allowed to operate certain rackets in Harlem's borders. Protection, some gambling, loan sharking. In exchange, they left the numbers game largely to the black operators. It wasn't respect. It wasn't friendship. It was mutual recognition that an all-out war would cost everyone more than cooperation was worth. Men like Bumpy Johnson ensured that cooperation stayed cooperative. Charlie Lucky Luciano had gone to prison in 1936 on forced prostitution charges, but his organization continued operating under various lieutenants. One of those lieutenants was a man named Antonio Tony Butch Corallo, though in 1939 he was still relatively unknown, still building his reputation. Another was Ignazio Iggy the Hammer Lupo, a brutal enforcer who ran operations in East Harlem and the Italian sections near Harlem's borders. But the man who managed a delicate interface between Italian operations and Harlem's black underworld was Vincent Vinnie Chips Mangano, a capo in what would later be called the Gambino family. Vinnie was in his early 40s in 1939, thick around the middle, with slick-back hair going gray at the temples and a face that looked friendly until you noticed his eyes never smiled. He ran the Regency Club, a gambling establishment and social club, on East 116th Street, right on the border between Italian East Harlem and Black Harlem proper. The Regency Club was neutral territory, theoretically, a place where business got discussed, where arrangements got made, where problems got solved before they became wars. Vinnie Chips prided himself on being diplomatic. He'd tell people he was a businessman, not a thug. He'd talk about the new way of doing things, about cooperation and mutual profit. He'd shake hands with black numbers runners, smile at them, pour them drinks. And then he'd talk about them behind their backs like they were children playing gangster. In the world Bumpy Johnson navigated, respect wasn't abstract. It wasn't about feelings or politeness. Respect was structural. It was the architecture that kept violence at manageable levels, that allowed illegal businesses to function, that prevented every minor dispute from becoming a bloodbath. When someone disrespected you publicly, they weren't just hurting your feelings. They were testing whether you could be pushed, whether your boundaries meant anything, whether your reputation, the only real asset in that business, was solid or hollow. And once people decided your reputation was hollow, you were finished. It didn't matter how tough you'd been yesterday. In that world, you were only as strong as your last response to being challenged. Vinnie Chips knew this, which makes what happened next even more calculated. It was September 14th, 1939, a Thursday evening. The Regency Club was hosting a private card game, high stakes, invitation only. Players included Italian mob associates, a few corrupt union officials, 2 police lieutenants from the 23rd Precinct who were on various payrolls, and one black numbers banker named Raymond Ray Ray Hewitt. Ray Ray was one of Bumpy's people. He'd been running a numbers operation in the Sugar Hill neighborhood for 6 years, paying his percentages up the chain, keeping his operation clean and professional. He'd been invited to the Regency Club game as a gesture of goodwill, Vinnie Chips extending a hand across the racial divide, showing that business was business, that the color line didn't matter when. Money was on the table. Except it did matter. It always mattered. The game ran for about 4 hours. Ray Ray was up about $800, which wasn't a fortune but wasn't nothing either. He was playing conservatively, not showing off, not rubbing wins in anyone's face. Professional. Around 11:30 p.m., during a break in the dealing, Vinnie Chips was telling a story. Something about a colored porter at Grand Central Station who'd been caught stealing from luggage. The story involved exaggerated dialect, physical comedy, references to watermelons and chicken. The white men around the table laughed. The 2 police lieutenants practically fell out of their chairs. Ray Ray sat there with a frozen smile, understanding exactly what was happening. Then Vinnie Chips turned to him directly. Ray Ray, no offense, right? We're all friends here. Just a joke. You got a sense of humor, right? Every man at that table knew what was happening. This wasn't about humor. This was about establishing hierarchy. This was Vinnie Chips reminding everyone in the room, including Ray Ray, that black gangsters might be tolerated, might be dealt with, might even be invited to high-stakes games, but they were still less than. They were still there at the sufferance of white men who could mock them to their faces and expect them to smile about it. Ray Ray understood something else, too. If he objected, he'd be the problem. He'd be the one who couldn't take a joke, who was too sensitive, who was causing trouble. The 2 police lieutenants would remember him as difficult. Vinnie Chips would spread word that Ray Ray was thin-skinned, unreliable, emotional. In that world, emotional men didn't last long. So Ray Ray did what he thought was smart. He laughed. Not too hard. That would look weak, but enough to signal he wasn't going to make an issue of it. He nodded, said, "We're all good, Vinnie," and the game continued. He left around 1 a.m., collected his $800 in winnings, shook hands with Vinnie Chips at the door, and walked out into the September night. And then he went directly to find Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson was at the Rhythm Club on 132nd Street, when Ray Ray found him. It was about 2 a.m. The club was in its late-night phase, the serious drinkers and the insomniacs, the musicians finishing their gigs at other venues, the women who worked nights, the men who lived nights. Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo was playing on the jukebox. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and whiskey vapor and expensive perfume. Bumpy was at his usual table in the back corner, position that let him see both entrances and had a clear path to the kitchen exit. He was drinking bourbon. Neat. He was alone, though he was never really alone. There were always people within shouting distance who worked for him, who owed him, who'd move when he moved. Ray Ray approached the table, and Bumpy saw immediately that something was wrong. Ray Ray was a calm man, professional, not prone to drama, but his jaw was tight. His shoulders were up around his ears. He was carrying tension like a physical weight. Bumpy gestured to the chair across from him. Ray Ray Saturday. What was said between them stayed between them. No witnesses ever testified to the specific words. But what's known is this. Ray Ray talked for about 15 minutes. Bumpy didn't interrupt once. He sat there, sipping his bourbon, his face absolutely expressionless, while Ray Ray explained what had happened at the Regency Club. The joke, the laughter, the humiliation, the choice between accepting disrespect and causing an incident that could spark a war. When Ray Ray finished, Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked one question. Did the cops laugh? Ray Ray nodded, loudest of anyone. Bumpy finished his bourbon, set the glass down with precise care. Go home, Ray Ray. Get some sleep. You did the right thing telling me. That was all he said. Ray Ray left, and Bumpy sat there in the rhythm club for another 20 minutes, not moving, not speaking, just thinking. People who knew him learned to recognize that stillness. It wasn't peace. It was calculation. It was a man running scenarios in his head, gaming out consequences, determining exactly what needed to happen next. The next morning, Friday, September 15th, Bumpy Johnson did something unexpected. Nothing. He went about his usual routine. He collected reports from his numbers runners. He resolved a dispute between two street lottery operators about territory boundaries. He had lunch at Jock's place on 145th Street, where he was seen by at least a dozen witnesses laughing and talking with associates, seemingly without a care in the world. Word travels fast in Harlem. By Friday afternoon, people knew about the incident at the Regency Club. Not the details. Ray Ray wasn't broadcasting his humiliation, but enough. A whisper network of bartenders and bookies and women who worked in clubs, people who heard things and traded information like currency. They knew something had happened. Something involving Bumpy's people and Vinnie chips. And they waited to see what Bumpy would do. When he did nothing, people started wondering. Was Bumpy getting soft? Was he afraid of the Italians? Was he calculating that a response wasn't worth the war it might start? Some of his younger soldiers were getting nervous. In that world, perception was reality. If people thought you couldn't respond to disrespect, you became a target for every ambitious hustler looking to make a reputation. But Bumpy's oldest associates, the ones who'd watched him operate for years, they recognized a pattern. This wasn't hesitation. This was something far more dangerous. This was Bumpy thinking. Vincent Mangano wasn't just another mob enforcer. He was part of a specific generation of Italian-American gangsters who'd come up during Prohibition, who'd watched the Castellammare's war reshape organized crime in the early 1930s, who'd seen Commission get formed with its rules and hierarchies and territorial divisions. He'd been born in Sicily in 1898, came to America as a child, grew up in the tenements of Little Italy and East Harlem. He'd done the usual progression: street gang member, enforcer, bootlegger. He'd survived the Prohibition Wars, which was itself impressive. Most men in that business during those years ended up dead or in prison by their 30th birthday. Vinnie had made it through by being diplomatic, by being the guy who could negotiate, who could find compromises, who kept the temperature down when hotheads wanted to start shooting. The bosses valued that. They promoted him. By 1939, at 41 years old, he was a capo with his own crew, his own territory, his own revenue streams. He ran loan sharking operations, protection rackets, several legitimate businesses that laundered money, a linen supply company, 2 restaurants, a garbage hauling service. and he managed a delicate interface between the Italian families and Harlem's black underworld. That last responsibility was crucial. Harlem in 1939 represented enormous economic opportunity. Hundreds of thousands of black residents, many of them recent migrants from the South, all of them shut out of legitimate banking and business opportunities, all of them turning to informal economies and illegal businesses out of necessity. The numbers game alone generated millions of dollars annually. There was money to be made in Harlem, but it required understanding the community, understanding the power structures, understanding men like Bumpy Johnson. The Italian families wanted that money. Of course they did. But they'd learned from the Dutch Schultz disaster that simply invading Harlem with guns didn't work. The community protected its own. Black gangsters like Bumpy Johnson and Madame St. Clair had deep roots, community support, and the advantage of knowing their territory intimately. So the families needed intermediaries. They needed men who could negotiate, who could establish working relationships, who could extract profits without triggering a war that would bring too much police attention and cost more than the profits were worth. Vinnie Chips was that intermediary, and he was good at it. He'd established the arrangement where Italian operations got certain rackets, black operators kept others, and everyone made money. He'd personally negotiated agreements with Bumpy Johnson on at least 3 prior occasions, resolving disputes before they became violent. He considered himself practically a diplomat. But he'd made a critical miscalculation about Bumpy Johnson. He'd confused tolerance for weakness. He'd mistaken Bumpy's willingness to negotiate as indicating Bumpy could be pushed. He'd seen Bumpy choose peace over war and decided that meant Bumpy was afraid of war. That mistake was going to cost him everything. On that Friday night, September 15th, Vinnie Chips held court at the Regency Club like nothing had happened. Because to him, nothing had happened. He'd told a joke. The joke had landed. A colored numbers runner had laughed along like he was supposed to. Business as usual. He told the story again that Friday night, to a different audience. How Ray Ray had sat there, how he'd laughed, how he'd known his place. Vinnie was using it as an illustration of proper hierarchy, of how to handle the delicate racial politics of Harlem business. You got to keep them in their place, but you got to do it smooth, he explained to 2 of his soldiers. You don't just beat them down, that makes martyrs. You make jokes, you laugh with them, you make them laugh at themselves. That's control. That's how you manage these mullahs without starting a war. The soldiers laughed, not because it was funny, but because Vinnie was their capo and you laughed when the capo made a joke. What Vinnie didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that one of the Regency Club's bartenders, a light-skinned black man named Thomas who passed as Italian, who worked there precisely because he could pass, who nobody realized was feeding information to Bumpy Johnson, was listening to every word. By Saturday morning, September 16th, Bumpy knew exactly what Vinnie was saying behind closed doors. He knew Vinnie was treating the incident as a victory, as proof of Italian superiority and black subordination. That's when Bumpy made his decision. Not because of the initial disrespect, that was almost routine in that world, but because Vinnie was continuing the disrespect. He was using it as a teaching moment, spreading it as a story, making it a narrative about racial hierarchy and power. If Bumpy let that narrative stand, it wouldn't just be about Ray Ray. It would become the story that defined Italian-black relations in Harlem. It would embolden every 2-bit Italian street soldier who wanted to push black operators around. It would undermine every negotiation, every agreement, every hard-won accommodation. The mathematics of reputation demanded a response. But Bumpy didn't want to start a war. War was expensive, unpredictable, and ultimately bad for business. What he needed was something surgical. Something public enough to restore his reputation, but targeted enough that it couldn't be used as justification for all-out conflict. Something that sent a message to Vinnie Chips specifically, to the Italian families generally, and to Harlem's entire underworld economy. He needed theater. He needed symbolism. He needed to walk into the one place he wasn't supposed to go and walk out untouched. Saturday, September 16th, Bumpy spent making arrangements. He didn't broadcast what he was planning. Operational security in that world was life and death. But he did certain things that, in retrospect, were clearly preparations. He met with Stephanie St. Clair at her apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. What they discussed was never recorded, but she would later say that Bumpy came to her for advice, not permission. He explained what had happened, what he was planning, and what the potential consequences were. Stephanie's response, according to her, "Do what you need to do, but do it clean." Clean meant no unnecessary violence. Clean meant a message sent without starting a war. Clean meant coming out of it with enhanced reputation, not just satisfied revenge. Bumpy also met with several other key figures in Harlem's underworld: numbers bankers, policy operators, union men, nightclub owners. He was building consensus, letting people know that what was coming was about principle, not personal vendetta, about maintaining Harlem's autonomy, not starting chaos. And he spent time, alone, thinking through every detail. Where he'd go, when he'd go, who he'd bring, what he'd say, how he'd position it, what Vinnie's likely responses were, what the Italian family's likely responses were, what the police response would be, how to control the narrative afterward. Bumpy Johnson had learned, over 2 decades in the streets, that violence was easy. Violence was what amateurs did when they ran out of better ideas. What separated professionals from thugs was the ability to apply violence precisely, surgically, with maximum impact and minimum collateral damage. He was planning a lesson in applied force. Sunday morning, September 17th, 1939. Bumpy Johnson woke up at 7 a.m. in his apartment on Convent Avenue. He went through his normal routine: coffee, newspaper, breakfast. He dressed in one of his best suits, charcoal gray, 3-piece, perfectly tailored. White shirt, burgundy tie, gold cufflinks. His .38 revolver in a shoulder holster, concealed under his jacket. Black Italian leather shoes, polished to a mirror shine. He looked like he was going to church, which in a way, he was. He spent the afternoon quietly. Lunch at home. Reading. Listening to the radio. News from Europe about the German invasion of Poland. Speculation about whether America would eventually enter the war. Normal Sunday activity for a man who had nothing urgent on his schedule. Around 6 p.m., he left his apartment. He walked. Didn't take a car. Didn't call for a driver. Just walked, leisurely, down Convent Avenue, east toward 5th Avenue, then south through the dusky September evening. Harlem on a Sunday evening in 1939 was transitioning from sacred to profane. Churches were letting out, families walking home in their Sunday best. But the nighttime economy was waking up. The clubs were starting to open. The street vendors were setting up. The working women were emerging from tenement apartments, heading to their corners and their clients. Bumpy walked through all of it like he owned it, because in a very real sense, he did. He stopped at a newsstand on 125th Street, bought a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, talked with a vendor about the weather. Completely normal, completely unhurried. Then he continued east, crossing into the Italian sections of East Harlem. The neighborhood changed. Fewer black faces, more Italian families. Different storefront signs, Italian bakeries, pork stores, social clubs with names like Fratelli d'Italia, Società di San Rocco. Different ambient sounds. Italian opera playing from open windows instead of jazz. Different languages mixing in the street chatter. 3 of Bumpy's men, never identified publicly, never charged with anything, were shadowing him at a distance, watching his back, but staying far enough away that it didn't look like an invasion force. This had to look like one man, alone, making a point. At 7:34 p.m., witnesses would later agree on this time with remarkable consistency. Bumpy Johnson arrived at the Regency Club on East 116th Street. The Regency occupied the ground floor of a 4-story brick building. It had a green awning over the entrance, the club's name in gold letters. 2 small windows flanking the door, frosted glass, deliberately obscuring the interior from street view. The building itself was owned by a shell corporation that traced back to the Mangano family, used for meetings, gambling, and the kind of business transactions that couldn't happen in legitimate establishments. On a Sunday evening in September, it would be moderately busy, maybe 25 people inside. Card games running, drinking, socializing, men conducting business in quiet corners. Bumpy stood on the sidewalk for a moment, finishing his cigarette. He was giving people time to notice him, time to recognize what was about to happen. Then he dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his heel, and walked through the front door. The thing about walking into a place where you're not supposed to be is that there's a moment, a split second, where everyone has to decide how to react. That moment is chaos. That moment is opportunity. Bumpy Johnson understood that moment intimately. He opened the door and stepped inside, and for maybe 3 seconds, nobody reacted at all. The club's interior was what you'd expect. Dark with paneling, dim lighting, circular tables with chairs, a bar along the left wall, a door in the back that led to a private card room. The smell of cigar smoke and beer and marinara sauce from the kitchen. Frank Sinatra's All or Nothing at All playing on the jukebox. About 18 men scattered around the room. Most of them Italian, all of them connected to the Mangano crew in some capacity. 2 of them were made members of the family, actual initiated members of La Cosa Nostra, not just associates. And then they saw him, a black man in a suit, standing in the doorway of the Regency Club. Not a porter, not a delivery man, not someone there to serve. Bumpy Johnson, standing there like he had every right to be present. The bartender, a thick-necked Sicilian named Enzo who'd killed at least 2 men during the bootlegging wars, froze with a bottle of whiskey halfway to a glass. A card game at a table near the bar stopped mid-deal, for men staring. 2 soldiers standing near the back room door reached instinctively toward their jackets, toward weapons. Bumpy didn't reach for his gun. He didn't threaten anyone. He stood there, calm and composed, and said in a clear voice that carried through the entire room, "I'm here to see Vinnie Chips. Tell him Bumpy Johnson would like a word." The sentence did multiple things simultaneously. It was polite, would like a word, which made violent response harder to justify. It was public. Everyone in the room heard it, which meant Vinnie couldn't pretend it didn't happen. And it was confident, absolutely absent of fear, which forced everyone to recalculate what they thought they knew about racial hierarchies and power. Enzo, the bartender, looked toward the back room, uncertain. This was unprecedented. This broke every unwritten rule about how Harlem's racial boundaries worked. Black gangsters didn't walk into Italian social clubs, not uninvited, not alone, not demanding an audience. But nobody wanted to be the person who started the shooting. Not yet. Not without knowing what was happening. One of the maid members, a capo named Salvatore Sallybones Bonacorso, a man responsible for at least a dozen murders, a man who had been in the life since he was 14 years old, stood up from his card table. He was in his 50s, gray-haired, wearing suspenders over a white dress shirt. He looked at Bumpy with the kind of cold assessment that comes from decades of violence. "You lost, boy?" Sally Bones asked, not yelling, almost conversational. But the word boy was deliberate, calculated. Bumpy turned to face him directly. Didn't smile. Didn't flinch. "I know exactly where I am. I'm here to see Vinnie Chips about a matter of business. You can get him, or I can wait. Makes no difference to me." The room was absolutely silent now. The jukebox had finished its song. Nobody moved to play another one. Sally Bones tilted his head slightly, studying Bumpy. He was doing mathematics in real time. This man, this black man, had walked into the Regency Club, alone, unarmed as far as anyone could tell, and was standing there like he belonged. That took either courage or stupidity, and Sally Bones had been in the life long enough to know that stupid men didn't survive to become legends in Harlem. Which meant this was courage. Which meant this was dangerous. "Wait here," Sally Bones said finally. He walked to the back room door, knocked twice, went inside. Bumpy stood in the entrance, not moving further into the room, not making himself threatening, but also not backing down. The other men in the club watched him. A few hands stayed near weapons. Nobody spoke. 30 seconds passed. 40. A minute. Then the back room door opened, and Vinnie Chips emerged. Vincent Mangano had been in the middle of a private card game when Sally Bones interrupted. 5-card stud, high stakes, Vinnie up about $1,200 for the evening. He'd been in a good mood, drinking expensive scotch, smoking a Cuban cigar, enjoying his Sunday evening. Sally Bones leaned in and whispered, "Bumpy Johnson's here, in the club, asking for you." Vinnie's first reaction was confusion. This had to be a joke, a misunderstanding. Then Sally Bones' expression registered, dead serious, maybe even a little concerned, and Vinnie understood this was real. His second reaction was anger. The absolute audacity of this colored gangster walking into his club, demanding to see him, like they were equals. Like racial boundaries and territorial rules didn't exist. But Vinnie Chips hadn't survived 20 years in the mob by being reckless. He controlled his anger, thought for a moment, then made a decision. If Bumpy Johnson wanted a meeting, he'd give him one, but it would be on Vinnie's terms, in Vinnie's place, with Vinnie's men surrounding them. Maybe this was an opportunity. Maybe Bumpy was here to apologize for Ray Ray's presence at the game, to smooth things over, to acknowledge that the Italians were in charge. Maybe this was Bumpy knowing his place after all. Vinnie stood up, smoothed his shirt, took one more pull on his cigar, and walked out of the back room. What Vinnie Chips saw when he emerged stopped him for just a moment. Bumpy Johnson, standing near the entrance, completely relaxed. His hands were visible, not in his pockets, not near any weapon. His expression was neutral, almost pleasant. But there was something in his eyes, something cold and calculated that Vinnie had seen before in dangerous men. And more importantly, Bumpy was drawing every eye in the room. Every man in the Regency Club was watching this interaction, which meant whatever happened next would be witnessed, remembered, and repeated. This was public. Vinnie walked toward the entrance, conscious that he was on stage now. He couldn't appear weak in front of his own men, but he also didn't want to escalate something that might still be salvageable. "Bumpy," he said, voice level, "this is unexpected. We don't usually do business on Sundays." It was an attempt at normalcy, at suggesting this was just an irregular meeting, nothing significant. Bumpy smiled slightly. "I won't take much of your time, Vinnie. Just wanted to discuss something that happened here on Thursday night. The card game. My man Ray Ray was here." Vinnie's stomach dropped. So this was about the joke, which meant this was about pride, about respect, about exactly the kind of masculine posturing that could turn into bloodshed. "Yeah, Ray Ray was here," Vinnie said carefully. "Good player. Took home some money, as I recall. Everything was friendly." "Was it?" Bumpy asked. The question hung in the air. Vinnie tried to deflect. "Come on, Bumpy. We were all just having fun. Nobody meant anything by it. Just joke between friends." "Friends," Bumpy repeated. He let the word sit there for a moment. Then, "Vinnie, I need you to understand something. When you disrespect one of my people, you disrespect me. And when you tell stories afterward, laughing about it, making it a point about who's in charge, about who has to smile and take it." He paused. "That's not something I can let pass." The room was dead silent. Every man present understood what was happening now. This wasn't about apologizing. This wasn't about smoothing things over. This was about power. Vinnie felt the attention of his men on his back, felt the weight of expectation. He was being challenged in his own club by a black gangster in front of his crew. If he backed down, his authority was finished. But if he escalated, this could turn into a shootout that would bring police attention and possibly a full war with Harlem's entire underworld. He chose aggression, but calibrated aggression. "Bumpy, I think you're confused about how things work," Vinnie said, voice hardening. "This is my place. These are my people. You walking in here, making demands? That's disrespectful. That's the kind of thing that could get someone hurt." It was a threat, but phrased indirectly enough that it wasn't quite a declaration of war. Bumpy nodded slowly, like Vinnie had just confirmed something he'd suspected. "See, that's the problem, Vinnie. You think this is your place. You think you can say whatever you want, do whatever you want, and black folks are just supposed to smile and take it because you're Italian and we're not." Bumpy took one step forward. Just one. Not threatening, but no longer standing in the doorway either. Now he was in the club, on Vinnie's territory. "Let me explain how this is going to work," Bumpy said, his voice still calm, still conversational, but carrying absolute certainty. "You're going to apologize. Not to me, to Ray Ray. You're going to go to his place of business tomorrow, in front of witnesses, and you're going to say you were out of line, that the joke wasn't appropriate, that it won't happen again." Vinnie stared at him, genuinely shocked. An Italian Capo, apologizing to a black numbers runner, in front of witnesses? It was unthinkable. It would destroy his reputation. It would make him a laughingstock. You're out of your mind, Vinnie said. That's never going to happen. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket. Every man in the room tensed. Hands went to guns. Safeties clicked off. The sound of a half-dozen weapons being drawn. Bumpy pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not a gun. Paper. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone could see it wasn't a weapon. Then he held it up so Vinnie could see. You know what this is, Vinnie? Vinnie looked at the paper. His face went pale. It was a ledger page. A copy. Bumpy wasn't stupid enough to bring an original, but clearly a copy of financial records. Names, dates, dollar amounts. Payoffs to police. Kickbacks from union officials. Records of illegal gambling operations. Everything documented in precise, incriminating detail. Where did you get that? Vinnie asked quietly. Doesn't matter where I got it. What matters is what I do with it. Bumpy refolded the paper, put it back in his pocket. Now, I'm a businessman, Vinnie. I don't want a war. Wars are bad for business. But I also can't let disrespect stand, because that's also bad for business. So here's the deal. You apologize to Ray Ray. Publicly. Tomorrow. And this paper, and the other copies I've had made, they stay with me, private. Nobody sees them. Nobody uses them. It was blackmail, pure and simple. But it was also something more sophisticated. It was an off-ramp. Bumpy was giving Vinnie a way to comply without it looking like he'd been intimidated by a physical threat. Vinnie could tell himself, and tell his bosses, that he'd made a strategic calculation to protect sensitive information, not that he'd backed down from a black gangster. Vinnie's mind was racing. That ledger page, if it got to the police, if it got to prosecutors, if it got to the commission, it would end him. Prison at best, death at worst. The mob didn't tolerate members whose sloppiness endangered the organization. But apologizing to a black man, in public, that would also end him, just in a different way. Bumpy watched Vinnie calculate, watched him struggle with the mathematics of reputation versus survival. And then Bumpy did something that changed the entire dynamic of the encounter. He smiled. Not a threatening smile. Not a mocking smile. An almost friendly smile, like they were old associates solving a problem together. Vinnie, let me make this easier for you. You don't have to grovel. You don't have to humiliate yourself. Just go to Ray Ray tomorrow. Tell him the joke was out of line, that you respect his business, and that you hope there's no hard feelings. That's it. 30 seconds of conversation. And then we go back to normal business. Nobody has to die. Nobody goes to prison. Nobody starts a war. We all make money and go home to our families. It was brilliant. Bumpy was reframing the apology as a smart business decision, the sophisticated choice, not a submission. He was giving Vinnie a narrative that Vinnie could use to save face with his crew and his bosses. And the implicit threat remained. Refuse, and the ledger pages go public. Vinnie stood there, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. His soldiers were watching, waiting to see how their capo would handle this. Would he maintain respect by refusing? Or would he maintain survival by agreeing? Sally Bones had moved closer during the conversation, positioning himself where he could shoot Bumpy if things went wrong. But even Sally Bones looked uncertain now. This wasn't a situation that called for shooting. This was a negotiation, and negotiations required thinking, not violence. How do I know you will keep those papers private? Vinnie asked finally. It was a stalling tactic, but also a signal that he was considering compliance. Because I keep my word, Bumpy said simply. Ask anyone in Harlem. When Bumpy Johnson says something, it happens. When I make a deal, I honor it. That's why people trust me. That's why my business works. It was both a reassurance and a subtle reminder. Bumpy's reputation was built on being a man of his word, which meant he was also a man who followed through on threats. Vinnie was trapped, and he knew it. Every option was bad, but some options were worse than others. He looked at Sally Bones. Sally Bones gave a tiny shrug, a gesture that said, "You're cool, but this might be the smart play." Vinnie looked back at Bumpy Johnson, standing there calm and composed, like he had all the time in the world. "Fine," Vinnie said finally. "I'll talk to Ray Ray tomorrow. Clear the air." Bumpy nodded. "Smart decision. Vinnie, this is how business should work. Problems get solved without bloodshed." Then Bumpy did something nobody expected. He extended his hand for a handshake. Vinnie Chip stared at Bumpy's extended hand. A handshake? Here, now, in front of Vinnie's entire crew? It would be photographed in everyone's memory as Vinnie backing down, Vinnie accepting subordinate status, Vinnie being forced to treat a black gangster as an equal. But refusing to shake would break the agreement they just made, would signal that Vinnie wasn't actually committed to the resolution, would give Bumpy justification to release those ledger pages. Vinnie was damned either way. After a 3-second pause that felt like an hour, Vinnie reached out and shook Bumpy's hand. Firm grip, professional, the kind of handshake that sealed business deals in that world. And Bumpy, holding Vinnie's hand, leaned in slightly and said, quiet enough that only Vinnie and maybe Sally Bones could hear. Vinnie, I walked in here alone because I wanted you to understand something. If I can walk into your place, uninvited, and walk out again on my terms, that means your place isn't as secure as you think it is. Remember that the next time you're tempted to make jokes about my people. Then he released Vinnie's hand, nodded respectfully, turned, and walked out of the Regency Club. Just like that. No theatrics. No threats. No violence. He walked out the front door, onto East 116th Street, into the September evening, and disappeared into the darkness of Harlem. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes. Inside the Regency Club, for about 15 seconds after Bumpy left, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They were processing what they'd just witnessed. Sally Bones was the first to break the silence. Vinnie, what the fuck just happened? Vinnie didn't answer. He was still standing by the entrance, staring at the door Bumpy had walked through, trying to understand how he'd lost control of that situation so completely. One of the younger soldiers, a kid named Pauli who was maybe 22, who'd only been with the crew for 6 months, said what several people were thinking. Boss, we can't let him get away with that. Walking in here like he owns a place? We got to do something. Vinnie turned to look at Pauli. The kid wilted under the gaze. We're not doing anything, Vinnie said flatly. That was business. It's handled. But... It's handled, Vinnie repeated, voice like iron. Sally Bones understood what Vinnie was doing. Vinnie was trying to reframe the encounter as a negotiation, not a surrender. He was trying to maintain authority by presenting the decision to comply as strategic, not forced. But everyone in that room had seen what happened. They'd seen Bumpy Johnson walk in alone, make demands, leverage information, and walk out with Vinnie's compliance. They'd seen a black gangster treat their Italian Capo as an equal, or maybe as something less than an equal. That image would be impossible to erase. Word spread through Harlem before Bumpy even made it back to 125th Street. The grapevine worked at electronic speeds in that neighborhood. Bartenders called bookies. Bookies called numbers runners. Numbers runners called policy operators. Within 2 hours, everyone in Harlem's underworld economy knew. Bumpy Johnson had walked into the Regency Club and walked out untouched. The details got exaggerated in the retelling, as details always do. Some versions had Bumpy pulling a gun. Others had him bringing a dozen armed men. A few had him physically fighting Vinnie Chips. But the core truth remained. Bumpy had gone into Italian territory, alone, challenged the Capo, and emerged victorious. By Monday morning, September 18th, Bumpy Johnson's reputation had transcended gangster respect. He'd become mythological. He'd become the man who broke the racial boundaries that governed organized crime, who'd proven that black gangsters could stand toe-to-toe with Italian mob captains and not just survive but win. Monday afternoon, September 18th, 1939, Vinnie Chip showed up at Ray Ray Hewitt's numbers operation on 140th Street. It was about 3 p.m. Ray Ray was in his office, really just a back room in a ground-floor tenement apartment, when one of his runners came in, nervous. Boss, Vinnie Chips is here. He wants to talk to you. Ray Ray's stomach went cold. Was this retaliation? Was Vinnie here to kill him for whatever Bumpy had done? But Ray Ray had been in the life long enough to know that panicking was fatal. He told his runner to bring Vinnie in, and he sat behind his desk, trying to look calm, trying to look professional, while his heart hammered in his chest. Vinnie walked in, alone. No soldiers, no weapons visible, no threat posture. He looked tired. He looked like a man fulfilling an obligation he resented but couldn't avoid. Ray, Vinnie said, I want to apologize for Thursday night. The joke I told, the way I acted, it was out of line. You're a professional, you run a good operation, and you deserve better respect than that. I hope there's no hard feelings, and I hope we can continue doing business. The words came out stiff, clearly rehearsed, clearly forced. But they came out. Ray sat there, stunned, an Italian mob captain, apologizing to him, in his office, where his runners could witness it. Sure, Vinnie, Ray managed. We good. No hard feelings. Vinnie nodded, turned, and left without another word. Ray sat there for a long moment after Vinnie departed, trying to process what had just happened. Then one of his runners, who'd been listening from the doorway, started laughing. Not mocking laughter, relieved laughter, amazed laughter. Boss, do you know what this means? Vinnie Chips just apologized to you. To you. That's never happened. Ever. Ray started laughing too, the nervous energy finally releasing. And then he did what anyone in Harlem would do with news that's significant. He picked up the phone and started making calls. Within hours, everyone knew. Vinnie Chips had apologized. Bumpy Johnson had forced an Italian Capo to back down and apologize to a black numbers runner. The impossible had happened. The immediate aftermath of the Regency Club incident wasn't dramatic. There was no war, no retaliatory hits, no escalating violence spiraling out of control. That absence of drama was itself significant. It meant the Italian families had decided, consciously or through inaction, that going to war over Vinnie Chips' humiliation wasn't worth it. They'd lost face, but starting a conflict with Harlem's underworld would cost money, draw police attention, and potentially disrupt the profitable accommodations they'd established. So they absorbed the loss. They accepted the new reality, and they adjusted their strategy accordingly. Vinnie Chips, though, paid a price. He wasn't killed. The mob generally didn't kill captains for getting outmaneuvered, especially when they'd managed to avoid a war. But he was demoted, quietly, over the next 6 months. He lost his position managing relations with Harlem. He was reassigned to less prestigious operations, loan sharking in Brooklyn, some labor union rackets. Still a made man, still earning, but no longer trusted with delicate diplomatic work. Because a commission, the organized crime ruling body that oversaw the 5 families, had realized something important. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a street thug to be managed with force. He was a sophisticated operator who understood leverage, information, and psychological warfare. He needed to be dealt with as a peer, not as a subordinate. That recognition changed everything. Within a year of the incident, organized crime in Harlem operated under a significantly different paradigm. Italian families still had operations there, still made money, still exercised influence. But they did so with explicit recognition that black gangsters like Bumpy Johnson controlled territory that couldn't simply be invaded or dominated. The relationship became genuinely reciprocal. Italian families provided certain services, connections to politicians, access to corrupt police officials, laundering infrastructure. Black operators provided other services, street-level intelligence, community relations, access to Harlem's enormous informal economy. Neither side loved the arrangement, but both sides respected it, which in that world was more valuable than affection. Bumpy Johnson's reputation, meanwhile, became legendary, not just in Harlem, but throughout New York's entire underworld. He became known as the man who'd stood up to the Italian mob and won. The man who'd walked into the Regency Club alone and walked out on his terms. Young black gangsters studied his method. Old black gangsters told stories about him. White gangsters treated him carefully, understanding that underestimating him was dangerous. He'd achieved something remarkably rare in organized crime. He forced a structural change in how racial power operated, not through massive violence or dramatic conflict, but through strategic calculation and perfectly applied pressure. The years that followed the Regency Club incident would be complicated for Bumpy Johnson. He'd spend significant portions of the 1940s and 1950s in prison on various charges, narcotics, mainly, though whether he was actually dealing drugs or being targeted by authorities who wanted him off the streets remains debated. Prison didn't diminish his influence, though. He ran operations from inside, maintained his network, and emerged from each incarceration with his reputation intact. By the 1960s, he became a genuinely legendary figure in Harlem. A man who'd known Malcolm X. They'd met in the 1940s. Malcolm later spoke respectfully of Bumpy's community work. A man who'd allegedly influenced real estate development in Harlem, steering money toward projects that benefited the community. A man who walked a strange line between criminal and community protector. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, heart attack, collapsed in a Harlem restaurant at age 62, thousands of people attended his funeral. Legitimate community leaders, politicians, and known criminals all showed up to pay respects. The New York Times ran an obituary calling him a semi-mythical figure in Harlem. But the legend that defined him, the story that would be told for the next 50 years, was a night in September 1939 when he walked into the Regency Club. The easy reading of that story is about violence, about a black gangster standing up to white supremacy through force. And there's truth in that reading. Bumpy Johnson did stand up to racism, did challenge the structures that positioned black Americans as subordinate even in the criminal underworld. But the deeper reading is about intelligence and strategy. Bumpy Johnson didn't win that confrontation because he was willing to fight. Plenty of men were willing to fight. He won because he understood something more sophisticated, that power operates through perception, that reputation is currency, and that the threat of consequences is more effective than actual violence. He gathered information, the ledger pages that gave him leverage. He'd chosen his moment. Public enough to matter, targeted enough to avoid war. He'd offered an off-ramp, letting Vinnie save face while still achieving compliance. And he controlled the narrative, making sure everyone understood what had happened, ensuring the story spread on his terms. That's not thuggery. That's strategic thinking of the highest order. The Regency Club incident also reveals something about how systems of oppression work. Vinnie Chips wasn't some cartoon villain. He was a product of a system that taught him black people were subordinate, that racial hierarchy was natural, that disrespect toward black men had no consequences because the broader structures of society would protect white authority. Bumpy Johnson proved that assumption wrong. Not by overturning the entire system. He was one man, operating in a specific context, and systemic racism obviously continued. But by carving out space where black autonomy was recognized, where black intelligence and organization were respected, where black men could demand dignity and enforce consequences when dignity was denied, that mattered. It mattered then, and the legacy matters now. The Regency Club still stands on East 116th Street, though it's no longer a mob hangout. The neighborhood has changed dramatically. East Harlem gentrified, then changed again, went through waves of demographic shifts and economic transformation. The building that housed the Regency is now retail space on the ground floor, apartments above. There's no plaque, no historical marker noting what happened there in September 1939. Most people who walk past have no idea that this was a location where a quiet revolution occurred, where one man's refusal to accept disrespect changed the power dynamics of organized crime in New York City. But those who know the history, who study Harlem's past, who understand the invisible architectures of power and resistance, they know. They tell the story. They pass it down. Because the story isn't just about one gangster and one incident. It's about the constant, exhausting, dangerous work of demanding respect in a world designed to deny it. It's about the intelligence required to navigate systems that want to crush you. It's about the courage to walk through doors you're not supposed to enter, to stand in rooms where you're not supposed to exist, and to refuse to leave until the terms have been reset. Bumpy Johnson understood that. He lived it. And on one September night in 1939, he proved it. Stephanie St. Clair, Madam Queen, would later say something about Bumpy that captured his method perfectly. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He didn't need to throw a punch to win a fight. He just needed to show up and let people realize they'd miscalculated. That's what happened at the Regency Club. A miscalculation, corrected. A boundary, redrawn. A man, standing alone, proving that intelligence and preparation could shift the balance of power even when everything else, law, society, structural racism, said it was impossible. Vincent Mangano probably thought he was telling a joke on September 14th, 1939. Just some casual racism, the kind that was so normal in that era it didn't even register as cruelty. Just asserting hierarchy, reminding everyone how the world worked. What he didn't understand was that the world was changing. Slowly, painfully, through the accumulated resistance of thousands of people refusing to accept the terms offered to them. Bumpy Johnson was one of those people. Not a perfect person. He was a criminal, violent when necessary, complicit in industries that cause harm to his own community. But in that moment, in that place, he represented something larger than himself. He represented the refusal to be humiliated, the demand for dignity, the insistence that respect wasn't something white men granted at their discretion, but something black men could claim and enforce. That's why the story matters. That's why it's remembered. That's why, 85 years later, we're still talking about the night Bumpy Johnson walked into the Regency Club. September 17th, 1939. A Thursday that became a Sunday in memory, a single night that echoed for decades. One man, one decision, one walk through a door that wasn't supposed to open for someone like him. History is made of those moments. Not the grand battles or famous speeches, but the quiet assertions of dignity in contexts where dignity is denied. The refusals to accept disrespect, even when refusal seems impossible. The strategic intelligence that transforms disadvantage into leverage. Bumpy Johnson understood power. Not the kind taught in textbooks or business schools, but the kind that operates in the shadows, in the spaces where official authority doesn't reach. The kind that says, you can't make me less than human, even if the entire system is designed to do exactly that. And for one night in Harlem, in an Italian social club that was supposed to be off-limits, he proved it. The question that story leaves us with is simple but profound. What doors are we not walking through because we've been told we don't belong there? What boundaries are we accepting because they seem immovable? What disrespect are we tolerating because resistance seems too dangerous, too costly, too impossible? Bumpy Johnson's answer was clear. You walk through the door. You face the consequences. You make them respect you, even if you have to rewrite the rules to do it. That's not always the right answer. It's not always possible. But sometimes, it's necessary. And when it works, when one person's courage shifts the balance of power even slightly, it creates space for everyone who comes after. That's Bumpy Johnson's legacy. Not the violence, not the crime, but the moment he walked into the Regency Club and changed what were possible. If this story moved you, if it made you think about power and resistance and the everyday courage required to demand dignity, leave a comment. Tell me what story I should cover next. What other moments of resistance and intelligence and strategic courage deserve to be remembered? And subscribe for more untold legends, the stories that don't make the textbooks, but that shape the world we live in. Because history isn't just what happened in palaces and battlefields. It's what happened on street corners and in social clubs and in every space where someone decided they wouldn't accept the role assigned to them. That's the history that matters. That's the history we carry forward.